The small country town of St. Mary Mead was known for its quiet streets, its charming cottages with ivy-clad walls, and its peculiar tendency to be untouched by the outside world. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where gossip was the fastest-moving currency, and where secrets, despite their best efforts, always seemed to find their way to the surface. Yet even in a place so seemingly serene, a mystery was brewing, one that would baffle everyone, even the most seasoned detectives. It was the sort of crime that seemed too simple to be taken seriously, yet too complex to dismiss outright. The crime itself had taken place in the stately home of Sir Arthur Langdon, a well-known art collector and patron of the local museum. His estate, a sprawling property nestled on the outskirts of the village, had long been a subject of fascination for the townsfolk. Inside, the walls were adorned with priceless paintings, each one more magnificent than the last. Sir Arthur, a man of considerable wealth and refined tastes, was known to host soirees that attracted artists, scholars, and various figures of distinction. But that evening, as the last of the guests had departed, something happened that no one could have predicted. It began with the painting, a large ornate canvas that hung in the grand foyer of the estate, a portrait of a woman, enigmatic in her grace and beauty. The painting had been a gift from a renowned artist, whose works had captured the imagination of many. The woman's eyes, despite being painted years ago, seemed to follow anyone who passed by. It was the kind of portrait that invited scrutiny, a painting that left a lingering feeling of something not quite right, even though nothing about it could be pointed to as odd. The evening had unfolded like any other. Sir Arthur had dined with a few of his colleagues and friends, discussing art, history, and the latest auction trends. His guests had lingered in the drawing room, sipping brandy, their laughter filling the space. But when the clock struck midnight, there was a sudden, strange shift. One of the guests, a young man named Thomas Fletcher, had gone to the foyer to inspect the portrait again, something about it bothering him. But when he returned to the group, his face was pale and his hands trembled. He couldn't explain what he'd seen. All he knew was that something had changed about the painting. The woman's expression had shifted. Her smile had disappeared, replaced with a look of despair and fear. At first, no one took him seriously. They thought he was merely drunk, his vision clouded by too much brandy, or perhaps his mind had wandered into the realms of overactive imagination. But when they all turned to the portrait to confirm Thomas's account, the painting remained as it had been, still, calm, and untouched, or so they thought. The following morning, Sir Arthur's housekeeper, Mrs. Bartley, entered the foyer to begin her usual chores. She was the first to notice the change. The woman in the portrait, whom everyone had assumed was a mere figment of the artist's skill, now appeared to be looking directly at her. Her gaze was sharper, more deliberate, as though the woman had been watching her for years, and now, for the first time, she was truly seeing her. Mrs. Bartley, unsettled by the sensation, hurried out of the room and immediately reported the matter to Sir Arthur. The old man, intrigued yet puzzled, had called in the local constable, George Farrow. Constable Farrow was a practical man who had seen his share of odd occurrences, but this was different. There was no sign of tampering, no evidence of a break-in, and yet the painting seemed to possess an eerie energy. A detailed examination revealed nothing. No new brushstrokes, no disturbances in the frame, no signs of fraud. It was as though the portrait had changed overnight, inexplicably and without reason. It wasn't just the housekeeper or the guests who had noticed it. Other villagers, familiar with the famous portrait, began to notice the shift as well. The woman's once serene smile had been replaced with a haunting expression, as if something had gone terribly wrong in her world. And soon enough, rumors began to spread, turning what had initially been a small mystery into something far more intriguing. Was it a curse? A supernatural event? Or, as Sir Arthur suspected, a simple trick of the mind, perhaps the result of too much wine or the power of suggestion. To add to the mystery, no one could quite agree on when the change had occurred. Some said it had been gradual, happening over the course of the night, while others insisted that it had been instantaneous, that the expression had shifted the moment they looked away. Whatever the truth, there was one thing that could not be denied. The painting was no longer the same. The police were stumped, and so, when the case reached an impasse, Sir Arthur turned to someone who had solved more than her fair share of perplexing situations. Miss Marple, the sharp-witted and unassuming detective who lived just down the road, was called in to investigate. She had, on occasion, helped the local constabulary with matters too complex for their limited resources, and though her methods were unconventional, they often proved effective. When Miss Marple arrived at Sir Arthur's home, she was not greeted with fanfare or great expectation. Her reputation, despite its successes, was still viewed with a certain amount of skepticism by the townsfolk. But as she stood before the painting in the grand foyer, her keen eyes studied every detail, and her mind immediately began to sift through the possibilities. There was something about the expression of the woman in the portrait, something deeper than mere brushstrokes, that spoke to Miss Marple. She could sense a story beneath the surface, a hidden narrative woven into the very fabric of the image. It was not a supernatural event at all. No, this was something much more human, and it was only a matter of time before the pieces fell into place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple stood before the painting, her thoughts clear. There was a clue here, hidden in plain sight, something that the others had missed. It wasn't just the change in the woman's expression, but the fact that it had been noticed so suddenly, by so many, that was truly telling. The crime, it seemed, was not what it appeared to be. The painting had not changed on its own. Someone had altered it, deliberately, and with a very specific purpose in mind. Now, it was time for Miss Marple to uncover who that someone was, and why they had done it. Miss Marple stood with quiet poise, her gloved hands folded lightly at her waist, her eyes fixed on the portrait as though it were a puzzle only she could decipher. Around her Sir Arthur paced with growing agitation, the constable leafed through his notebook, and a few lingering guests watched from a respectful distance, whispering in uneasy tones. But Miss Marple heard none of it. Her focus was absolute. While others debated whether the woman in the painting had truly changed, or if it was a trick of collective imagination, Miss Marple considered something far more concrete: motive. She asked to see the guest list from the previous evening. Sir Arthur obliged, passing her a small card with names scribbled in pencil: Thomas Fletcher, Dr. Elliot Rowe, Beatrice Lane, Alfred and Violet Kendricks, and Margaret Fel. Miss Marple glanced at the names, then looked up. And how many of these people are familiar with the painting? All of them, Sir Arthur answered. It's one of my most admired pieces. People always comment on it. That woman's gaze. It has a presence, don't you think? Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. Too much presence, perhaps. One begins to wonder if that presence is being used for something more than admiration. She asked to walk the house alone. The constable seemed unsure, but Sir Arthur gave a nod. As she moved through the foyer again, she paused not before the painting, but beneath it. Her eyes scanned the base of the frame, the skirting board, the nearby side table. Her fingers brushed the edge of the rug, where she crouched carefully, picking up something small and hard. It was nearly invisible against the carpet, but her eye, trained over years of knitting and flower arrangement, and paying attention to the tiniest inconsistencies, spotted it immediately. A thin fragment of varnished wood with a sharp angle and a flake of paint attached. She examined it silently and tucked it into her handbag. Her gaze then moved toward the corridor leading to the back staircase. Most guests would have entered and exited through the front, but the servants' passage, narrow, shadowed and flanked by old portraits, offered a more discreet path. Miss Marple followed it slowly, noting every creak in the floorboards and every picture along the walls. Halfway down the corridor, her hand brushed against a small smear on the wall, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably fresh. She bent closer. It was a smudge of some oily substance, like linseed mixed with pigment. She returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests were gathered, sipping tea and murmuring about the painting. Miss Marple's eyes swept the group, landing briefly on Margaret Fel. Margaret was a tall, self-contained woman with a reputation for owning sharp opinions and sharper tastes. She was a distant cousin of Sir Arthur's, invited out of family courtesy more than fondness. As Margaret spoke to Violet Kendricks, Miss Marple noticed something unusual. Margaret kept her gloved hand partially clenched, resting it against her hip in a way that seemed unnatural. More curiously, she never raised her cup of tea with that hand. Miss Marple made a mental note, then addressed the group with a pleasant smile. "I wonder," she said, "did any of you happen to walk through the back corridor last night? The one with the rather grim-looking ancestors?" Thomas Fletcher looked confused. Beatrice Lane frowned, shaking her head. But Margaret's eyes flicked up just a second too late, and her answer came a second too quickly. "Of course not. Why would anyone go there?" "A draft, perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "or curiosity. The portraits are quite imposing. I imagine someone might find them compelling." Margaret didn't respond, and Miss Marple let the silence stretch for a beat before turning to Sir Arthur. "Might I ask who has access to the painting when guests aren't about?" Sir Arthur thought. "Myself, Mrs. Bartley, the housekeeper, and, I suppose, the maid, Lillian, although she doesn't go near it unless she's dusting." Miss Marple requested a word with Lillian, and the nervous girl was summoned promptly. She looked pale and jumpy, and when Miss Marple asked if anything unusual had happened the previous night, her fingers began to fidget with the hem of her apron. "No, ma'am. Nothing unusual." Miss Marple watched her. "Even when you went to dust the frame this morning?" Lillian froze. I didn't dust it this morning." "No, but Mrs. Bartley said she found you in the foyer at 7. "I was cleaning the vase, not the painting. I didn't touch the painting." Her voice had grown sharp, defensive. Miss Marple observed the girl's trembling hands, the way her eyes darted towards Sir Arthur, as though afraid of disappointing him. After Lillian was dismissed, Miss Marple turned once more to the foyer. This time, she stood close to the painting, her face inches from the surface. The oils were old, expertly layered, but something was wrong. There was a faint line, almost a seam, running just beneath the woman's chin, cleverly concealed with subtle brushwork. And above that line, the varnish had a slightly different sheen, not visible to a casual viewer, not even to someone who stared long, but to someone with the right kind of eye. It was unmistakable. The portrait had been tampered with, not replaced. No, the canvas was the same, but altered, retouched. A new expression overpainted with remarkable skill. Whoever had done it was not only technically proficient, but daring enough to execute the change overnight, and confident enough to believe no one would catch it. Miss Marple stepped back. A plan had formed. There was deception at play, yes, but also fear. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this painting tell a different story, and not merely for artistic reasons. The altered expression, so subtle, so deeply unsettling, was a message. But to whom? And why? She turned to Sir Arthur and asked if any recent acquisitions had upset anyone. Perhaps a jealous peer, an artist passed over, a collector denied. Sir Arthur shrugged. The art world's full of pettiness, but nothing out of the ordinary except... He paused. Yes, Miss Marple urged. There was one thing, a letter. Arrived anonymously last week. Said I'd stolen a piece that didn't belong to me. That it would be returned to its rightful mood, whatever that means. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. That was the key. This was not just a change in paint. It was a warning, a reclamation, a silent accusation made in oils and brushstrokes. Someone had sent a message not in words, but in expression, and Miss Marple intended to find out who had the nerve and the talent to send it. The letter had shifted the tone of the investigation. Until that moment, the mystery had seemed rooted in art, perhaps forgery, perhaps vandalism, but now Miss Marple saw something deeper, something personal, a message that claimed theft, not of property in the traditional sense, but of dignity, emotion, or perhaps even identity. Returned to its rightful mood. That phrase nagged at her. She knew how artists sometimes spoke of their work as living things, capable of joy, sorrow, fear. Someone believed this portrait had been wronged, and they had taken it upon themselves to correct it. She began with Thomas Fletcher. The young man, still pale from his earlier shock, sat nervously in the drawing room, twisting his ring around, his finger. Miss Marple offered him a kindly smile and sat beside him without fuss. "You were the first to notice the change," she said. "That must have been unsettling." Thomas nodded quickly. I thought I was imagining it, but I swear, when I looked at her, she wasn't smiling anymore. She looked terrified." "Had you looked at the painting earlier in the evening?" "Yes, when we arrived. I always do. It's beautiful. The woman's expression, it's what makes it." "Did you speak to anyone about it at the time?" "Only briefly to Beatrice. I mentioned how she seemed sadder than usual, but she said I was being fanciful." Miss Marple made a note in her mind. "Did you leave the drawing room at any point after that?" "I went to the foyer again around midnight, just before we left. That's when I noticed it properly, the change." She let silence stretch, watching his fingers tremble slightly. "Did you see anyone else near the painting?" "No, just me. Too quick, too clean." He was trying to be helpful, but it was the kind of help that avoided details, likely out of fear rather than guilt. Miss Marple didn't press further. She knew the tone of genuine fear, and this was it. Thomas was hiding something, but not about the painting. Next was Beatrice Lane, a fashionably dressed woman with quick eyes and a tendency to correct others mid-sentence. She had a forceful way of speaking, as if asserting control over every conversation she entered. When Miss Marple asked about the portrait, she waved her hand airily. "Honestly, I think people are reading too much into it. It's just a painting. You didn't notice a change?" "Not really. Maybe her mouth looked different. But that happens with old canvases. Light, varnish, imagination. And yet you were discussing it with Thomas?" Beatrice's expression didn't falter, but there was a beat too long before she answered. "He was going on about it. I told him not to be dramatic." "Were you in the foyer after dinner?" "Only once, to fetch my coat. Alfred Kendricks was with me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You're certain it was Alfred?" "Quite." Beatrice was too confident. She dismissed the mystery because it didn't suit her to engage with it. But her tone was too firm for someone simply disinterested. She was pushing the subject away, hard enough to make Miss Marple suspect she'd seen more than she admitted. That, or she feared what attention might fall elsewhere if the painting became the center of inquiry. Alfred and Violet Kendricks were interviewed. Next, they presented a unified front, but in the way that couples sometimes do when they've rehearsed their account. Alfred, a portly man with an air of entitlement, spoke for them both. "Didn't notice anything wrong with the painting, no. Looked the same as always. And yet Beatrice claims you were with her when she fetched her coat near the foyer." He hesitated. Yes, I believe I was." Violet stiffened. "That's not right, dear. You were speaking with Dr. Rowe then." "I fetched the coat." A pause. Alfred glanced at his wife. "Ah, quite right." Miss Marple nodded politely. "You understand, I'm simply trying to establish the order of things." Violet leaned in. We may not remember everything clearly. It was late and there was a great deal of brandy passed around. But Miss Marple saw it now, the first real crack. Someone had forgotten their lines. Either Alfred had lied about being in the foyer, or he had a reason for wanting to distance himself from Beatrice, or both. Dr. Rowe was next. A quiet man, academic, in manner whose grey eyes rarely blinked. He had said little all evening, yet had remained in the background of every group. When Miss Marple asked what he recalled about the painting, he frowned thoughtfully. I remember it clearly. I've seen it many times over the years. The change is real. Her eyes, there's pain there now. Someone altered it, no doubt. And you believe this was done overnight? I do. The shift in tone is too intentional, not a trick of light. It's deliberate. You seem quite certain. He nodded. I've studied art for decades. This isn't aging or imagination. It's a new hand. And did you mention this to anyone last night? No, I hadn't noticed until this morning, but I did see something odd last night. Miss Marple waited. Margaret. She left the drawing room for nearly 20 minutes, said she needed air, but she didn't go out through the main doors. And you're sure of this? I'm sure she disappeared, and when she returned she looked strained, as if she'd seen something unpleasant. That aligned with the corridor smear and the concealed hand. Margaret was protecting something. Whether it was herself or someone else remained to be seen. Margaret Fel entered with the air of a woman being interrogated unfairly. I hear I've become a suspect in an art mystery, she said with dry amusement. Not a suspect, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Simply someone with access and an opportunity. I didn't alter the painting. I wouldn't know where to begin. You left the group during the evening. For a walk. My head was pounding. You didn't pass through the foyer. Margaret hesitated. Briefly. You were seen returning through the servants' corridor. A pause, sharp and silent. Found myself lost, Margaret said. I didn't want to cause a fuss. You also seemed to be concealing your hand earlier. Margaret looked down at it now. The glove remained on. A cut from a splinter. One of the chairs in the drawing. Room has a broken armrest. Miss Marple made no comment, but her eyes remained steady. Margaret was lying, but not the way a guilty person lies. She was covering something, protecting it, shielding it. But Miss Marple sensed it wasn't out of malice. It was fear again, the same type she'd seen in Thomas. As the afternoon waned and the guests began to drift away under polite excuses, Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing room. She was certain now someone had tampered with the portrait. The motive was buried in the shifting accounts, the stammered timelines, the contradictions that unfolded when the guests were pressed just slightly. Someone had painted over the woman's smile and given her anguish in its place, not just to deface, but to communicate, to accuse. But of what? Miss Marple watched the last slant of light cross the carpet, the portrait looming quietly behind. Her. It was no longer just a question of who had altered the painting, but who the painting was meant to confront. Miss Marple remained seated long after the others had dispersed. The light had faded to a dim glow through the drawing-room windows, casting long streaks across the floor as the painting loomed overhead unchanged, but no longer neutral. It felt now like a witness, one frozen in time, bearing silent testimony to a crime no one yet understood. Her mind traced over each conversation, each slip of the tongue, each strained glance. There was something binding them all together, something not yet spoken but threaded beneath the surface like the tight weave of a well-made lace shawl. The question was not just who had changed the painting, but why so many people seemed desperate to mislead her about where they were and what they saw. She began listing their motives, not aloud, but in the quiet space of her memory. Margaret Fel, for instance. She had opportunity. Long minutes unaccounted for, a suspiciously concealed hand, and an inconsistent story about wandering for air. But her reaction to being questioned hadn't been anger or outrage. It was protectiveness, tinged with guilt. Not the guilt of someone caught, but of someone covering for someone else, Thomas Fletcher. He was the first to notice the change, but also the first to suggest the painting had shifted before anyone else agreed. Why speak up so quickly? Was he the red herring or the hidden thread? He seemed frightened, not just by what he'd seen, but of what he might be accused of. That kind of fear often stemmed from past entanglements, something deeper than a casual dinner guest would show. She'd sensed no artistry in him, though, and no motive to change the painting himself. If he was involved, it was tangential, connected through emotion rather than action. Beatrice Lane, sharp, dismissive, and overly confident. She hadn't just denied noticing a change, she had tried to belittle anyone who did. That sort of posture often concealed something personal. Her insistence on irrelevance was too forceful, and she'd mentioned Alfred Kendrick's being with her near the foyer, a detail contradicted by Violet. Why lie? Had she seen something or someone near the painting and sought to distance herself before anyone could ask why she hadn't intervened? The Kendricks themselves. A couple of rehearsed answers and minor contradictions. Alfred may have lied to protect Beatrice or himself, but neither showed any real concern for the painting's transformation, which, in its own way, was telling. Indifference often followed guilt, unless they thought themselves clever enough to rise above suspicion, and Dr. Rowe, quiet, measured, observant. He had been watching the others more than the painting. His admission about Margaret's absence hadn't felt like malice. It had the precision of someone cataloguing events, perhaps too precise. And then there was the letter. Anonymous. A threat to Sir Arthur's integrity, suggesting the painting had been stolen in some moral or emotional sense. That letter changed everything. This was no idle vandalism. The phrase kept echoing, returned to its rightful mood. Miss Marple stood and walked again to the painting. She stared not at the woman's eyes this time, but at the brushwork. The area around her mouth had that faint gloss of a newer varnish. Someone with training had done this, but the skill it required, not just to paint, but to do so under pressure and within a narrow window of time, was substantial. That narrowed the field. Not just anyone could have done it. One needed access to tools, paint, solvents, and most importantly, the confidence to believe it would pass as original unless scrutinized very closely. She needed to know more about the painting itself, its origin, the artist, and the subject. She asked Sir Arthur to join her and pressed gently. "Tell me," she said, "this portrait, who is the woman?" He looked up at it, arms folded. A mystery, that one. The artist was a friend, Elias Carswell. Died 5 years ago. Brilliant but tormented. He painted it near the end of his life. Never titled it. Just handed it to me. Said it was finished and left. Some say it was his lover. Others, his sister. He never confirmed. Did anyone else know her identity? Not that I'm aware. Though Margaret once mentioned she'd seen a similar face before, claimed it looked like someone she knew from years back. I didn't press. Margaret's always been sentimental about these things. Miss Marple's mind caught that detail like a burr on wool. A face from Margaret's past, a connection to the artist. That would explain her interest, her secrecy, even her agitation. But it still didn't explain the motive. If it was about memory, why change the painting? Why now? Later that evening, as she strolled down the gravel path away from the estate, she paused near the hedge where Lillian, the maid, was having a quiet cigarette, clearly thinking herself unseen. Miss Marple approached softly. "Lillian," she said kindly, "you said this morning you hadn't dusted the painting, but you looked frightened. What is it you're afraid of?" The girl blinked quickly, startled. Nothing, miss. Just didn't want to be blamed for something I didn't do. You weren't near the painting last night? No, miss. But you saw someone who was. A beat. Then the nod came. Nervous, reluctant. It was late. I came downstairs to fetch the coat Sir Arthur left in the dining room. I didn't want to disturb anyone. When I passed the foyer, I saw someone standing on the small ladder by the painting. Who? I couldn't see clearly. Just a shadow. But they were wearing gloves, dark ones, like Mrs. Fel's. And did you see them leave? Yes. Through the corridor, but they didn't know I was there. Miss Marple thanked her, heart steady, but thoughts stirring quickly now. A figure with gloves, working by lamplight, confident enough to use a ladder in the dead of night. She believed Lillian, and the gloves matched Margaret's, though Margaret hadn't denied her late absence, only dodged what she was doing. Perhaps the true deception wasn't in who changed the painting, but why it was changed in the first place. That night, back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. She could feel the net tightening around the truth. There were threads of greed, Sir Arthur's pride in ownership of a rare painting, perhaps acquired in ways not entirely honest. There was jealousy, too, if someone believed they were owed recognition for the art or its origin. But above all, there was fear. Not just the fear of being found out, but the fear of an old pain being brought into light. A stolen painting would bring scandal, but a stolen identity, a face immortalized under a false name, taken by a man and paraded as his own, would bring ruin. Someone had changed the painting not to destroy it, but to restore its truth. But in doing so, they had exposed themselves. Miss Marple had nearly all the pieces now. Only one visit remained. She would return to the house in the morning and speak with Margaret, not to accuse, but to ask a final, quiet question. Who was the woman in the painting, and what had been taken from her? Morning light crept through the frost-laced windows of Miss Marple's cottage as she finished dressing, fastening a modest brooch at her collar and tucking a folded note into her handbag. Her mind, sharp as ever, turned over the layers of the case with a quiet intensity. A portrait altered not for gain, but to correct a perceived wrong. A house full of guests offering alibis that bent, but did not quite break. A whisper of something, personal buried deep beneath each polished account, and now a thread that led back to Margaret Fel and an unnamed woman in a painting, a woman whose likeness, perhaps, had once belonged to someone real, someone lost, someone erased. At the Langdon estate, the mood had shifted. There was an atmosphere of conclusion, of boxes being ticked and order being restored. The constable, George Farrow, greeted Miss Marple with a sense of triumphant relief. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, beckoning her aside, "I dare say the mystery's wrapped up quicker than expected. Quite a stroke of luck this morning. We found this hidden in the gardener's shed." He held out a cloth-wrapped bundle, unwrapping it with the flourish of someone convinced of finality. Inside was a palette, several brushes, and a small jar of linseed oil. The brushes were still wet with pigment, the colours a near-perfect match to those on the altered portrait. "We'll dust them for prints, but there's more," he continued. "Turns out Thomas Fletcher spent the better part of last summer taking art courses in Florence. He didn't mention it when we questioned him." Miss Marple said nothing at first. She studied the brushes, the tools, the smudged hues on the ragged cloth. It was compelling evidence, if one believed in coincidences. But she did not. And something in the confident tilt of Constable Farrow's voice made her wary. Too quick, too eager. The desire to solve the case was clouding judgment. "Thomas may have studied art," she said gently. "But is he left-handed?" The constable frowned. "No idea." "What does that matter?" The retouching was done with a left hand. The brush, strokes curve inwards from the left side of the canvas. A right-handed person would struggle to produce that angle cleanly without contorting. Farrow's expression faltered slightly. Even so, it doesn't prove he didn't do it. He may have used his left deliberately to throw us off. Possible, she agreed, but unlikely. And if he had, he wouldn't have left his brushes so clumsily hidden, would he? Especially not in a shed he had no reason to enter. Farrow crossed his arms. Someone could be framing him. That, or we're being nudged toward a conclusion too conveniently. Just then, Sir Arthur entered the foyer, flushed with relief. You've heard, I suppose. They found the tools. Young Fletcher, of all people. He seemed harmless. Still, these things always come to light. Always. Miss Marple turned to him slowly. Sir Arthur, may I speak to Thomas before anything formal is decided? Of course, he said, but with the air of someone humouring a harmless old woman. Though I think it's quite clear now, isn't it? Thomas was seated in the study, pale and quiet, staring down at his clasped hands. When Miss Marple entered, he looked up with startled eyes, confusion written in every line of his face. They think I did it, he said. They actually think I broke into a painting to change it. I mean, I took art courses, yes, but I wouldn't dare touch something like that. Then tell me, Miss Marple said, sitting across from him, why you didn't mention your training before. I panicked. I thought if I said anything, they'd think it was me. I was the first to see the change. It already looked suspicious. Did you ever meet Elias Carswell? Thomas blinked. The artist? No, never. I only know his work from books. That painting, it's one of his best. She nodded, watching him closely. And did it remind you of anyone? Thomas hesitated. You know, yes, it did. But I thought maybe I was imagining it. Who? I once met Margaret Fel's sister years ago, only briefly. Her name was Clara, I think. She passed away, I heard. But that painting, something about the eyes, it looked just like her. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Another thread pulled taut. Clara. A name at last. A woman forgotten in words but preserved on canvas, now altered, her expression rewritten. It made sense now why Margaret had returned to the house that night, and why her guilt had been tinged not with shame, but with longing. She left Thomas with a few quiet reassurances and returned to the foyer, where Constable Farrow had begun preparing a formal statement. We'll hold him until the lab confirms the prints, he said. I reckon that should settle things. But Miss Marple stepped forward. No. I believe you're being led to a conclusion, Constable. The tools were planted and Thomas Fletcher is innocent. Sir Arthur sighed. But why would anyone go to such lengths to alter the painting? Miss Marple turned to him, eyes sharper now. Because the painting was never yours to begin with, not in the way you claim. Elias Carswell didn't give you that portrait out of goodwill. He died shortly, after painting it, didn't he? Sir Arthur's mouth thinned. Yes, and he left me the painting in his will. Did he? Or did you take it after his death, believing no one would contest it? Did you know who the subject was? He looked momentarily lost. I assumed it was a model. No, Sir Arthur, it was Clara Fel, Margaret's sister. Carswell loved her. But you took the painting, changed its title, and never credited her. You displayed it not as a tribute to a lost muse, but as a nameless beauty. That wasn't just theft. It was erasure. He said nothing. Miss Marple turned to Farrow. The real artist of the altered painting is Margaret. She trained briefly in France years ago. The signature on the lower corner was hers, barely visible, but it's there under the new varnish. The constable's brows drew down. So she did it. Margaret changed it? Yes. She waited until the house was full so suspicion would scatter. She used her knowledge of the old portrait's details, corrected what had been erased, and gave her sister back the dignity she'd been denied. But she didn't destroy the painting. She honored it. "And the letter?" Farrow asked. "Also, from Margaret," Miss Marple said softly. "Anonymously sent, but filled with bitterness. Returned to its rightful mood wasn't vandalism. It was grief. Clara died unknown, her story buried. Margaret tried to bring it back in the only way she knew." There was silence in the room now, heavy with the weight of the truth, and as Sir Arthur turned away, his pride wilting beneath the accusation, Miss Marple felt the faintest shift in the air. The case had not ended with applause or shackles, but it had ended for now. Still, she knew something lingered. The painting had changed again, yes, but not for the last time. Somewhere in the folds of human memory and art, someone else had watched this unfold, biding their time. Because while one truth had surfaced, another remained hidden, and the shadows behind the portrait still held secrets yet to rise. Rain swept softly over St. Mary Mead that evening, turning roads to glistening ribbons and muting the world with a hush that seemed almost reverent. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sat before the fire, not knitting, but holding in her lap a thin, aged envelope she had retrieved from her old letters chest. It bore a date from nearly 20 years ago and was signed by one Elias Carswell. She had remembered it only after recalling his name at Sir Arthur's estate. He had once inquired about boarding a room in the village and had written to her as a recommendation had come through her cousin Emily. He never came. But in the letter, he mentioned that he was moving to the countryside for inspiration and staying with a woman named Clara. At the time, it had meant nothing. But now, reading it with new eyes, the pieces began to shift. Clara was not merely a muse or a subject. She had lived and loved, and then been forgotten. And perhaps not by accident. The painting wasn't just art. It was a message, one created in love and stolen in silence. The next morning, Miss Marple requested to see the estate's archive room. Sir Arthur, still rattled but attempting a return to his usual routines, hesitated. "There's not much of use in there. Old invoices, letters, auction slips. All the better," Miss Marple said. "That's where truth likes to hide." He gave her access, albeit reluctantly, and left her in the cramped, dust-lined study near the east wing. Hours passed with only the soft shuffle of parchment and the occasional clink of an oil lamp being adjusted. She found invoices for artwork dating back to the 1930s, donation receipts for minor local charities, but none connected directly to the portrait, until she opened a folder marked Carswell Correspondence. There were 5 letters, brittle, with age but intact. Most were mundane, requests for payment, transport arrangements, but one stood out. A letter from a solicitor. It referred to an informal agreement made before Carswell's death. No will had been signed, but he had spoken clearly of his intentions. The portrait of Clara was to be returned to the family. To her sister specifically, who had once sat beside Clara during long afternoons while Carswell painted. It was a verbal bequest, noted but never legally honoured. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in her handbag. It wasn't just about artistic theft anymore. Sir Arthur had known. Perhaps not at first, but at some point he had read this, and he had chosen to ignore it. He displayed the portrait not just as an acquisition, but as a symbol of his standing. And by erasing Clara's name, he had erased a promise. She returned to the main house, where Margaret Fel sat alone in the library, her eyes distant. The previous day's events had left her subdued. When Miss Marple entered, Margaret gave a faint nod. "You were right," Margaret said. "I painted over the mouth. I tried to leave everything else untouched." Miss Marple sat beside her. "You did more than that. You signed your name." A breath caught in Margaret's throat. "I needed her to be remembered." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then asked softly, "Why now?" Margaret looked up, her expression lined with weariness. "Because I found something. A month ago. I was clearing out the last of my father's belongings, and I found letters. From Clara. She'd written them from Carswell's cottage. She talked about how happy she was, how she finally felt seen, not just admired, but understood. And then, silence. I didn't hear from her again after that year. I was told she'd moved abroad, that she didn't want to be found. Who told you? My father. And then later Arthur. They both insisted Clara had simply chosen a different life. But when I saw the portrait in Arthur's home years later, I knew. She hadn't moved on. She'd been silenced. Miss Marple nodded gently. Did Clara die here, Margaret? A pause, then a slow, reluctant answer. She died in childbirth. Carswell's child. She was too frail. They buried her quietly. No death certificate, no funeral. He was broken after. That's why he stopped painting. And Sir Arthur? He came to collect Carswell's things after his death. Clara's, letters, her belongings, the painting. He told me to forget it. Said it was best buried. Miss Marple felt her chest tighten. The crime then was not of violence but of memory. An erasure carried out with silence, reinforced over decades by power and pride. And yet, even so, the puzzle was not complete. She walked the halls again, stopping near the drawing room where a faint draught tickled her ankles. She turned and followed the breeze to a warped panel near the fireplace. Behind it was a narrow service nook, empty, but for a rusted trunk. Inside, photographs, sketches, and a single journal. It belonged to Clara. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, spoke of her time with Carswell. She wrote of Margaret often, her dearest friend, her anchor. She also wrote of Arthur, cryptic lines filled with unease. One entry near the end read, "He said the painting belongs to him now, that I will not be named. That love is irrelevant. What matters is the story he will tell." Miss Marple closed the journal carefully. The painting had been more than stolen. It had been rewritten. Clara's pain, her joy, her story, all covered with a false serenity that never belonged to her. Back in the foyer, she looked again at the portrait. The expression now, mournful, fierce, real, matched the entries in Clara's journal. Not a cry for justice, but for remembrance. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned the journal to Margaret. "You should decide what happens next," she said, gently. "But I suggest the portrait remain as it is. Let the world see her as she truly was." Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Do you think they'll believe me? That it was ever her face?" Miss Marple placed a hand on hers. "It doesn't matter what they believe. What matters is that you've returned her voice." But, even as peace settled over the house, Miss Marple's mind wandered back to one line in Clara's journal. "What matters is the story he will tell." Sir Arthur had crafted many stories in his time, about art, about legacy, about loss. But stories could be powerful weapons when built on lies. And now, she wondered, what other stories had he written? And who else had been edited out of them? Because secrets, once shaken loose, had a habit of rustling the past, and the past, as she well knew, never stayed buried for long. The journal sat unopened on Margaret Fel's writing desk, its leather cover still damp from Miss Marple's walk through the mist. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the garden paths glistened with puddles, and the air was thick with the scent of wet soil. Inside, the Langdon estate was unnervingly quiet. The portrait hung unchanged, its new expression now accepted in silence. But nothing about the case felt resolved to Miss Marple. Clara had been remembered, her identity reclaimed, but the sense of finality the others seemed to embrace did not sit easily with her. Too many details had fallen into place too easily. The journal had been found, the signature spotted, the motive unveiled, but the deeper current still moved beneath the surface. She replayed Clara's final journal entries in her mind, especially that chilling line. What matters is the story he will tell. The emphasis was not on theft or even betrayal. It was about narrative control, how one man's version of events had buried another's truth. Sir Arthur had insisted on returning the house to normalcy, displaying the portrait proudly again despite the scandal it had stirred. Margaret remained reclusive. The rest of the guests had left, and the village had already begun whispering its way back to gossip, assuming the mystery was closed. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that final acts rarely end with curtain calls. They ended with silence, and silence needed to be coaxed into speech. That morning, she returned to the estate under the guise of sharing Clara's journal with Sir Arthur. She found him in his study, sorting through a collection of silver spoons. With casual indifference, he received her with a strained politeness, gesturing for her to sit, but never quite meeting her gaze. "I thought perhaps," she said calmly, "you might want to see what Clara wrote. There are several mentions of you." He gave a small theatrical smile. "I'm afraid I don't see the relevance. The past is sentimental. It clouds things. Sometimes," Miss Marple replied, "and sometimes it reveals them." She placed the journal on the table between them, but made no move to open it. Instead, she drew from her handbag a small envelope. It was thin, yellowed, and bore the address of a gallery in London. "I came across this in your archives," she said gently. "A receipt for a sale made the year after Carswell's death. A painting by Elias Carswell sold under a different title, Study in Blue. The buyer, a collector in Paris. It fetched more than double what you claimed it was worth." Sir Arthur went still. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You see, I've been thinking. Clara's portrait wasn't the only one. There were others, studies, sketches. But only one survived here. The rest vanished, likely sold, quietly, profitably. I fail to see how that concerns anyone but me." "Oh, I don't think it does concern many people," she said, rising from the chair and walking slowly toward the painting. "Except for one. Someone who would have known Clara's face anywhere. Someone who watched her disappear from life, and then from memory. Someone who never saw justice." Sir Arthur said nothing. Miss Marple turned back toward him. "Would you mind terribly if I asked Margaret to join us?" He gave her a sharp look but nodded once. Margaret arrived within minutes, wrapped in a cardigan too light for the weather. Her eyes flicked between them, but she said nothing as she sat. Miss Marple reached into her bag again. This time she pulled out a small framed sketch, one of Clara, clearly unfinished, the outlines soft, but unmistakably familiar. "I found this in the trunk behind the panel. Alongside it was a letter, unsigned but unmistakably yours, Arthur. You promised to destroy the sketch, as it made Clara appear too alive. I wonder, did you ever ask her permission to exhibit her at all?" Sir Arthur straightened. "She posed willingly. Carswell paid her." "No doubt," Miss Marple said. "But you saw more in her than art. You saw an idea, a legacy. And when she died, you turned her into a myth. But myths can be dangerous things, can't they?" He smiled again, thin and unpleasant. "You've made quite a drama of it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Would you mind, Margaret, looking at this sketch for a moment? Closely. Tell me, what's missing?" Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward. Her fingers hovered over the glass. Her locket. Clara always wore it. It had a tiny silver frame with our mother's picture. She never took it off. Miss Marple's eyes didn't move from Sir Arthur. And yet in every sketch, every painting, even the final portrait, it's gone. You erased it. Margaret's voice sharpened. Why would you do that? But, sir, Arthur didn't answer. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. You knew the locket would tie her to a family. You didn't want that. You wanted her to be universal, nameless. You didn't just steal a painting. You stole her identity. Silence again. Then Margaret rose, fury trembling in her voice. You turned her into a ghost. Miss Marple let the weight of the moment hang before she shifted the tone deliberately. One last thing, she said. A small test, if you'll indulge me. Margaret, do you remember how Clara used to end her letters to you? Margaret blinked. Yes, she used to write, tell the truth and keep it folded in lavender. It was a saying from our grandmother. Miss Marple turned to Sir Arthur. Do you recall seeing that in any of the letters? He nodded too quickly. Yes, I remember it now. But Miss Marple gave him a long, knowing look. She never wrote it to anyone but Margaret. Not once. In her letters to Elias or to anyone else. I checked. You've never seen it written. You just heard it now. It was small, almost imperceptible. But his expression, tight, smug, controlled, broke for half a second. Not a confession, not quite. But a slip, a crack. And in it, Miss Marple saw what she needed. A man not sorry for what he'd done, but sorry to have been caught. Later that evening, as Margaret packed away the sketch and the journal, Miss Marple stood again before the portrait. Its expression remained unchanged, still somber, still alive. Clara had been restored, not just in oil and canvas, but in story. And as for Sir Arthur, he would face no charges. His crimes were not criminal in law, but reputations once stained had a way of fraying in public, and for a man who built his life on control, public disgrace was its own kind of justice. Miss Marple stepped out into the cooling air. There would be no grand revelations, no dramatic arrests, only truth, quiet, stubborn, and finally unfolded. Like lavender from a forgotten drawer. The following morning broke with an unusual stillness, the kind that seemed almost deliberate. The air held a brittle chill, and the garden of the Langdon estate looked as though it hadn't been disturbed in days, though Miss Marple knew otherwise. She arrived early, ahead of any planned visits, and was met by Lillian at the door, flustered, and whispering before the tea was even poured. "It's the study, miss," Lillian said, glancing nervously toward the corridor. "The cabinet with the old papers, Sir Arthur's archives. It's been broken into. No mess, really. But one of the folders is gone. The one with the Carswell letters." Miss Marple's heart didn't race, but her mind shifted into sharper focus. The pieces were beginning to line up too neatly. Motive, method, memory, and now, just when Clara's voice had begun to be heard, someone was moving to silence her again. She followed Lillian to the study and paused in the doorway. The cabinet door hung ajar, its lock twisted clean. The drawer that had contained the folder marked Carswell Correspondence was empty. Everything else was untouched. Sir Arthur was not yet present. According to Lillian, he had gone to the village to meet with his solicitor, an appointment hastily made the night before after Miss Marple's visit. Margaret, too, was nowhere in sight. The timing unsettled her. The journal was still in Margaret's possession and the sketch safely tucked in her desk drawer, but the missing documents posed a larger problem. Without the letters, the claim of Carswell's verbal bequest to Clara's family was again hearsay. It gave Sir Arthur room to spin the narrative back in his favour. Miss Marple did not speak of the missing file when Margaret arrived shortly after. Instead, she asked to borrow the journal once more, under the pretext of making a copy of certain pages. Margaret agreed without hesitation and excused herself to fetch it. But when she returned, her face was pale and her lips pressed in a tight line. "It's gone," she said softly. "I kept it in the drawer by my bed. I locked it. I always do." "Was it forced open?" "No. The lock's untouched." "Miss." Marple took a breath, steady and low. "Did you leave it alone yesterday after I returned it to you?" Margaret hesitated. "Only once. I walked to the conservatory after dinner, for air. I thought it was all over." Miss Marple knew now that the case wasn't finished. It had merely shifted. The journal, the sketch, the letters, each one tied to Clara's identity, her story, her place in the world, and one by one they were vanishing. This wasn't the work of panic. It was orchestration. Someone had the will, the access, and the urgency to remove every trace of truth before it settled into permanence. There was only one way forward. She called upon Dr. Rowe. Among the guests who had visited the estate, Dr. Rowe had remained quiet throughout, analytical, detached, but it was precisely that temperament Miss Marple needed now. She found him at the local museum archive, where he had returned to continue his research on regional artists. When she arrived, he was making notes in the margin of a catalogue entry. "I imagine this isn't a social visit," he said without looking up. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It's about the missing evidence." He looked up then, sharply. "Someone's tampering with the case?" "Yes. The folder of Carswell's correspondence has been stolen. The journal I returned to Margaret is gone. The sketch has not yet been touched, but I doubt it's safe either." Rowe frowned. "Then it isn't just guilt anymore, it's fear." "Exactly," she said. "And fear makes people foolish." Rowe considered that. "You believe Sir Arthur is behind this?" "I believe someone is helping him," she said. "Arthur is proud, certainly, but too arrogant to fear retribution. He relies on influence and silence. But the act of erasing these things, breaking, stealing, hiding, is not the work of someone at ease. Someone else is invested in keeping this story buried." He nodded. "Margaret?" "No," she said quickly. "She would have burned the painting if she wanted the truth hidden." "No, this is someone who believes the truth is dangerous." Dr. Rowe folded his hands. "Then you'll need bait." "I already have it," Miss Marple said. "They just don't know it yet." She returned to the Langdon estate with a carefully sealed envelope, which she placed prominently on Margaret's desk. It bore no label, no clue to its contents. But inside was a simple decoy, a copied page from a different journal, rewritten by Miss Marple's own hand, containing a fabricated confession from Clara that named her lover, her unborn child, and an intent to have her portrait destroyed. It was a lie, but one built carefully, a spider's thread of speculation, just convincing enough to tempt. Then she waited. By evening, the envelope was gone. She said nothing, simply returned the next day, claiming she had come to check on Margaret. Lillian, troubled but quiet, ushered her in and whispered something quickly before retreating. Margaret had gone into town that morning, alone, and Sir Arthur had returned from his solicitor's office in an unusually foul mood. Miss Marple made her way quietly to the study once again, and this time found the fireplace had fresh ash at its base. Curious, given no fires had been lit in days. She stirred the coals gently and uncovered charred fragments of parchment, too brittle to identify but unmistakably shaped like pages. Someone had read the letter and panicked. The bait had been taken. That evening, Miss Marple sat once again in the drawing room across from Sir Arthur. He was tired, and his posture had shifted, from the rigid confidence of a man above reproach to the thin weariness of someone struggling to maintain control of the narrative. "You've been busy," she said lightly. Visiting your solicitor. Retrieving property. He glanced at her warily. I've a right to protect my legacy, even if that means burning another person's truth. He stiffened. I left something in Margaret's study, she continued. An envelope. It wasn't real, of course, but the reaction was, someone took it, someone who thought it dangerous, someone who then destroyed it. You're accusing me of theft. No, I'm stating that someone is working very hard to ensure Clara remains silent, that her letters are gone, that her journal vanishes, that what little remained of her voice is being erased, again, and this time not by accident, but by design. Sir Arthur stood slowly. What would you have me do? Let her memory ruin what I've built. She built it with you, Miss Marple said. You merely locked the door behind her. And as she stepped out into the night again, she knew the final confrontation was near. Someone in the house was still holding something back, one last secret, one final thread. The evidence was vanishing, yes, but lies left shadows. And Miss Marple knew how to follow them. The evening pressed in with a damp stillness as Miss Marple left the Langdon estate, the narrow country lane slick with rain under her boots. The wind had quieted, but something heavier had settled in its place. A pressure, an anticipation, as if the truth she had been circling was about to rear its head with force. She had never relied on theatrics to draw out a confession. But this case had grown teeth. Clara's memory was no longer the only thing at stake. She reached home just after dusk. Her kettle was warm, the cottage familiar, but she felt no comfort. The game was still in motion, and she could not shake the feeling that her latest move, the planted envelope, had stirred a hornet's nest rather than flushed out a culprit. Someone inside the estate had reacted violently, burned supposed proof, and silenced what little remained of Clara's voice. And that someone, she feared, was not finished. The next morning came hard and grey, the clouds pressing low over St. Mary Mead. At 8:30, a knock came at her door. It was Lillian, soaked from the walk, eyes wide with panic. Miss Marple let her in before the girl could speak. "It's Margaret," she gasped. "She's gone." Miss Marple led her to the sitting room and wrapped her in a blanket, waiting for her to calm before asking the necessary question. "When did you last see her?" "Last night, after dinner." She was quiet as usual. She went up early, said she was tired. This morning, her bed hasn't been slept in, and her car is still in the drive. Miss Marple absorbed this silently. No note, no sign of distress. And yet, after the destruction of the false journal page, Margaret had vanished without a trace. It wasn't coincidence. They went together to the estate, arriving to find Sir Arthur in the library, feigning surprise but clearly rattled. He claimed ignorance, suggested perhaps Margaret had gone to London unexpectedly. When pressed, he admitted they had argued the night before. "She believes I've mishandled Clara's legacy," he said curtly. "She's mistaken, of course, emotional, but she left of her own accord." Miss Marple noticed the scratch along his cuff, half concealed by his jacket sleeve. She left no note, no suitcase, no coat. "It rained heavily last night, Arthur," she said softly. And yet her room was undisturbed. "She was upset," he snapped. "You've stirred things, Miss Marple. Perhaps too much." Miss Marple left him then, knowing the conversation would yield no more. But as she passed through the drawing room, she paused at the fireplace. Ashes again. Fresh ones, faintly warm. Someone had burned something else. She turned to Lillian. "Send word to Dr. Rowe, please. And the constable." The constable arrived within the hour, reluctant and sceptical, especially as there was no proof yet of foul play. Miss Marple insisted they search the grounds anyway. Sir Arthur was quick to protest, but his voice had lost its usual authority. The mood had shifted. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. It was Lillian who found the scarf. Damp, tangled in the hedge near the garden's far end, the cloth still bore the faint scent of lavender and something else. Turpentine. Miss Marple recognized it instantly. Artist's solvent. There was a moment, brief and raw, when she feared the worst. But there was no body, no trace of violence, just that scarf and the absence it marked. Inside the house, Dr. Rowe arrived at last, his coat dripping. Miss Marple brought him up to speed quickly, watching his face for the same shock she herself had felt. "Someone's escalating," he said grimly. "Not just burying the past, eliminating it." "We're being pulled towards something," she said. "A final act, perhaps. Margaret's disappearance isn't the end, it's the pivot." They sat in the library as rain began again, steady and cold against the windows. Miss Marple's thoughts turned over the sequence, Clara's erasure, the forged documents, the stolen journal, the burnt sketch. But the twist was not in the thefts. It was in the timing. "Arthur's desperation isn't just about legacy," she said suddenly. "It's about concealment, something more recent." "You think Clara's story is only part of it?" "I think Clara was the beginning, but the threat now is not memory, it's exposure." They reviewed everything again, this time from a new angle. Who stood to lose not from being connected to Clara but from Margaret speaking out? Then it hit her. She excused herself and went upstairs to the old guest wing. Rooms unused for years, dust on the handles, cold in the air. But one door, Margaret's old bedroom, was ajar. Inside, the bed was made, the wardrobe empty. But beneath, the floorboard nearest the window, a faint irregularity, she lifted it carefully. Inside was a bundle. Letters, not Clara's, but Elias Carswell's, dozens of them. Many addressed not to Clara, but to someone else. To Margaret. Miss Marple read with trembling hands. Elias had not only loved Clara, he had also corresponded in secret with Margaret after Clara's death. And the letters changed everything. Margaret hadn't just been a grieving sister. She had been Carswell's confidant, his guardian of truth, the one person he'd entrusted with the knowledge of what had really happened to Clara. The final letter, written just days before Carswell's death, was damning. Clara's death was not as simple as you were told. She was weak, yes, but she would have survived if not for the confrontation with Arthur. He accused her of ruining my career, of stealing my focus. There was an argument. She fell. The child died with her. I never told anyone. But Arthur took everything, even her name. If anything should happen to me, you must never let him display her face as his prize. Miss Marple folded the letter with a careful hand. The thefts, the burns, the silence, it all pointed to this. Sir Arthur hadn't merely stolen a painting, he had covered up an accidental death. And now, with Margaret possibly in possession of that final piece of evidence, he had removed her. Back in the foyer, she met Dr. Rowe's eyes. "We've been solving the wrong crime," she said. "Then what's the right one?" Clara's death was not natural, and Margaret knew. She tried to finish what Elias began, and now she's missing. Just then, the front door banged open. A constable burst in, his boots muddy, his breath ragged. "We've found her," he said, "near the river path. She's alive, but barely. Bruised, unconscious. Looks like someone tried to drag her off the bank." Miss Marple stood, steady despite the churn in her chest. "Then it isn't over," she said, "but it will be soon." And with that she gathered her coat and the final letter, ready now not just to solve a mystery, but to expose a long-buried crime before someone else disappeared into silence. The news that Margaret had been found alive spread quickly through the estate, though it brought no relief. She remained unconscious, her face pale, her breathing shallow, bruises blooming at her temple and wrists. She was discovered tangled in brush just off the river path, half submerged, her coat drenched and torn at the sleeve as if she had fought back. Miss Marple arrived at the scene shortly after the constables, her eyes moving not to the victim, but to the ground beside her. No footprints, washed out by rain, but the way the nearby reeds were bent told her Margaret had not stumbled there herself. She had been dragged. Back at the house, Sir Arthur feigned alarm. He offered dry brandy, furrowed his brow, barked at the staff for updates, but never once asked how Margaret was. Miss Marple watched him closely, saying little. Dr. Rowe stood beside her, equally silent. There was no longer any doubt someone had tried to silence Margaret permanently, but the timing had backfired. The blow hadn't killed her. And the attempt itself had exposed a desperation far greater than fear of scandal. It was nearing midnight when Miss Marple returned home. She sat in her armchair without removing her coat, staring at the fire while her thoughts churned. She laid Carswell's final letter on the table and reread it slowly, searching again for something overlooked. She knew Sir Arthur had stolen Clara's portrait. She knew he had lied about the nature of her death, but something about the exact events of that night still felt wrong. Clara had died during an argument, that much was clear, but the letter stopped short of blame. Carswell hadn't accused Arthur of violence, only of cruelty, of shattering Clara emotionally. And yet Margaret believed Arthur had caused her sister's death. Margaret had hidden that belief for years. So why hadn't she confronted him earlier? Why only now? The answer whispered in the room like a draught through an open window, and Miss Marple suddenly sat forward. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't even guilt. It was timing. She returned to the estate the next morning before dawn, moving quickly and with purpose. Lillian was there, pale but alert, and let her in without question. Miss Marple asked for access to the small studio Sir Arthur used at the back of the house, a converted sunroom where he kept wine boxes, old frames, and catalogues from auctions. No one had paid it much attention, but Miss Marple knew from her first visit weeks earlier that he kept something else there too. A display cabinet, glass-fronted and locked, filled with painter's tools, oils, brushes, solvents. She opened it now and carefully examined each row. At first glance it was as she remembered, but one brush, thin, fine, bristled, with a cracked blue handle, was out of place. It wasn't slotted properly like the others, but resting crooked on the tray, as if returned in haste. She picked it up, turned it, and saw a streak of varnish, still clinging to the base of the ferrule. Varnish, not paint. And next to it, tucked behind a bottle of linseed oil, a small, folded rag, charcoal-stained, smelling faintly of turpentine and lavender. Lavender. She had smelled it before, on Margaret's scarf. Miss Marple closed the cabinet slowly and sat down in the old wooden chair. A picture began to take shape in her mind, composed not of sudden shocks but of quiet details, layered one on top of the other. Margaret's sudden resolve. The altered expression in the painting, the rag, the missing journal, and most of all, Sir Arthur's remarkable calm, even as the threads of his lies began to unravel. He was never worried about being accused. He was worried about what Margaret would reveal, but not about the portrait. The painting was never the threat. It was what the painting had covered. Miss Marple stood quickly and made her way to the foyer. The portrait loomed once more in its gilt frame, familiar now, yet ever mysterious. She had looked at it so many times that the details no longer registered consciously. The curve of the cheek, the light across the collarbone. But now, she looked again, not at the face, but at the space just below the neckline. A pale patch of canvas, brushed over but oddly flat, too flat. She stepped closer. Miss Marple unpinned the tiny magnifier she wore at her collar a habit from years of embroidery, and held it to the painting. Her breath caught. There was something beneath the varnish. Not paint. A bump. A shape. A keyhole. The frame wasn't just decorative, it was covering a compartment. She moved quickly, calling for Dr. Rowe and the constable. With careful hands, they lifted the painting down from the wall. Behind it, set into the back of the frame, was a hidden drawer, sealed shut with a brass lock. It was old, rusted slightly, but intact. Miss Marple turned to the constable. "Sir, Arthur keeps an old key ring in his desk drawer. Fetch it. If he's locked this, it's among them." Minutes later, the lock clicked open. Inside was a shallow envelope, aged and sealed with red wax, along with 2 old black and white photographs. She opened the envelope and read aloud. "To whoever finds this, if something happens to me, let it be known." Clara didn't fall. She didn't faint. She didn't break. She was pushed by the man who hung her face on the wall. E.K. They turned to the photographs next. One was of Clara, younger, sitting on a low bench, wearing the locket Margaret had described. The other was of her and Elias, smiling, their faces close. It was not a portrait. It was a memory. Rowe exhaled slowly. So it was Carswell all along. He tried to leave a message inside the very thing Arthur stole. Miss Marple nodded. And Arthur must have found it after Elias died. He sealed the compartment, hung the painting, and pretended none of it existed. But Margaret knew. Maybe? She didn't know about the compartment, but she knew something had been hidden, something Elias left behind. She changed the expression not just to honor Clara, Rowe said, realizing it as he spoke. She was trying to provoke him, to shake the truth loose. And she nearly succeeded, Miss Marple added. But someone else knew too. Someone who got there first. Lillian stepped forward slowly. "There's something else," she said. "I wasn't sure before that, but a few weeks ago, I saw Beatrice Lane in the hallway. She was trying to open the cabinet in the studio. She said she was looking for Polish, but she seemed nervous." Miss Marple turned slowly, her mind racing. Beatrice, so tidy, so dismissive of the portrait's change, always quick to silence speculation, and more importantly, always around Sir Arthur. The pattern was no longer a web. It was a knot, tied tight with fear and self-interest. And somewhere within it, someone else had helped conceal the truth, not just decades ago, but now. Beatrice, perhaps, or someone even closer. Miss Marple rose, her voice calm. "We need to speak with Arthur and Miss Lane, separately, before anyone else disappears." Because what had once been a quiet mystery about a painting had revealed something far more dangerous, a truth hidden in plain sight, buried not just under layers of varnish, but in the habits of those who believed the past could be painted over forever. The house had fallen under a strange hush, the kind that arrives not from peace, but from the breath held before collapse. With the hidden compartment exposed and Elias Carswell's final confession laid bare, the portrait now sat not as art, but as evidence. The weight of its gaze had changed. No longer a symbol of mystery, it was a mirror, one that forced every remaining soul in the Langdon estate to see themselves more clearly than they wished. Miss Marple moved deliberately. Sir Arthur had been summoned to the study, where Dr. Rowe and the constable waited with the sealed envelope and photographs. She, however, asked for Beatrice Lane to be brought to the drawing-room, alone. Beatrice entered with her usual practiced calm, though her hands clasped tightly behind her back gave her away. Her eyes flicked to the empty space on the wall where the portrait had hung, then quickly to Miss Marple. "You wanted to speak to me?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. You were quite close to Sir Arthur during all of this. Always in his corner, always quick to dismiss the portrait, always nearby during key moments. That's a very loyal position to be in, Miss Lane. Beatrice's brow arched. I hardly think being supportive of a friend in distress is suspicious. No, but trying to access a locked cabinet in the studio, that is. The reaction was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A stillness, a flicker of calculation, and then the practiced smile returned. I was looking for polish. The housekeeper didn't have any. Polish is kept in the pantry, Miss Marple said. And Lillian remembers you being flustered when she saw you there. You weren't looking for polish. You were looking for the rag Margaret had used, or something Elias had hidden. But what you found instead, I suspect, was Margaret's scarf. After the attack, you helped cover for someone, Beatrice. Beatrice didn't speak. The silence stretched until Miss Marple stepped closer. It wasn't just loyalty. You weren't covering for Sir Arthur. You were covering for someone else. Beatrice's voice came then sharp and low. She was going to destroy everything. Who? Margaret. She spat. She wanted to drag everything into the light, all of it. Not just the painting, not just the letters. She would have destroyed what's left of Arthur's name, his career, everything he spent a lifetime building. Miss Marple tilted her head. And why does that matter to you? Beatrice's face twisted. Because he's my father. It hung in the air like a thunderclap. Miss Marple blinked once. Then the pieces fell swiftly into place. Beatrice Lane. A professional name. Independent. Polished. Always nearby but never central. Always stepping in when Arthur needed someone to manage things, fix errors, smooth scandal. A woman who never claimed connection, but always acted with a sense of ownership. Not a lover, not a colleague, a daughter. Beatrice stepped back slightly, her voice trembling now, no longer able to hold the mask. He never acknowledged it. My mother was a maid. One of many. She died when I was 15. I had to find out who he was on my own. I wrote to him when I turned 20. He sent me money, occasionally invited me to events, but he never introduced me as his child. He said it would ruin him. Miss Marple listened without interruption. He didn't want me in his world, but he used me in it. Quietly. I got jobs through his friends, invitations to events he pretended not to attend, but I wasn't allowed to claim anything. And then came the portrait. Clara's face, everywhere. Clara's name, always whispered but never spoken aloud. I asked once who she was. He told me to forget her, said she was nothing. But I saw how Margaret looked at that painting. I knew there was something he was hiding. Miss Marple spoke gently. So when Margaret began to speak out, you feared she'd expose not just Arthur's theft, but the lie you had built your life around. Beatrice's laugh was bitter. I thought if I destroyed the letters, the journal, all the bits of Clara, it would end. I didn't mean to hurt Margaret. I followed her that night. She had the journal again. I thought she was going to the constable. I tried to stop her. There was shouting. She slipped. I didn't push her. But you didn't help her either, Miss Marple said quietly. Beatrice looked down. You've spent your life chasing a man's approval who erased one woman and rejected another. And when the truth came close, you tried to protect the version of him that suited you best. She was going to ruin him, Beatrice whispered. No, Miss Marple said firmly. He ruined himself. Long ago. At that moment, the constable entered with word that Sir Arthur had confessed to knowing about the hidden drawer for years, and that he'd intentionally sealed it to prevent its discovery. He denied any role in Clara's death, of course, calling it an accident, but the letter and the concealed compartment told another story. Enough, at least, for the court of public opinion to render its own verdict. Beatrice did not run. She was taken quietly into custody for obstruction, for destruction of evidence, and for her role in the attempted cover-up of a decades-old death that had only now found light. Margaret, conscious at last, would recover fully. Her words, alongside Elias's letter and the photos, would tell the story in full, not just of a painter and his muse, but of a sister's fight to restore dignity, and a woman who nearly lost herself trying to protect the only man who never claimed her. As the portrait was removed from the estate to be restored and catalogued properly, Miss Marple stood beside it for a final moment. The expression remained solemn, but now it carried peace, not pain. "Justice takes many forms," she murmured to Dr. Rowe. "This one arrived in pieces, but it arrived all the same." And as she left the estate for the last time, the clouds finally broke above her, and a thin line of light cut through the trees, silent and sure. Miss Marple stood in the corridor outside Sir Arthur's study, her hands clasped gently in front of her, waiting. The portrait had been removed. Beatrice was under watch at the station. Margaret had been moved to her sister-in-law's cottage to rest under supervision. The house was quiet now, stripped of its illusions. But one final curtain had yet to fall, and Miss Marple had ensured that everything was in place for its descent. Inside the study, Sir Arthur paced. She could hear it through the door, his measured steps growing quicker, then stopping altogether. He knew. The discovery of the hidden compartment, the letters, the photographs, and now Beatrice's confession, each piece closing around him like the soft, sure movement of a clasp. She entered without knocking. He was at the window, staring, out toward the grey garden beyond the glass, though his reflection in the pane betrayed the set of his jaw, the flicker of his eyes. When he turned, his usual composure was brittle. "You've taken it all, haven't you?" he said flatly. "The painting, the letters, the girl." "I've taken nothing, Sir Arthur," Miss Marple replied. "You surrendered it long ago." "Piece by piece, I only helped lift the dust." He poured himself a drink with hands that were no longer steady and didn't offer her one. "So what now? Are you here to shame me? Parade me through the village square?" "I think shame has already settled itself quite comfortably on your shoulders," she said, stepping closer. "But no, I'm here to finish this. Properly." His laugh was dry. "And how do you intend to do that? Arrest me?" "No," she said. "But I will ask you to listen. Just once, not for me. For Clara." His mouth twitched. It was almost a sneer. But she saw something behind it now, a tightness not born of scorn, but of fear. She was a girl with a fragile heart and a strong spirit. She believed in Elias, not for what he could paint, but for how he saw her. And when he fell into despair, she tried to hold him together. "You knew that. You saw her in that house, in that state. You saw how much Elias depended on her." "I saw her draining him," Arthur snapped. "She was dragging him down. He had talent, genius, and he was wasting it." "You argued with her," Miss Marple said. "That night. You told her she'd ruined him, that her presence had corrupted his work, and she tried to leave." His hands gripped the edge of the desk now. She was hysterical. She was terrified. Miss Marple corrected gently. The journal said she was frightened of what Elias might do, but he didn't hurt her. He begged her to stay. And then you arrived. The silence was dense. Arthur didn't deny it. He sat heavily in the chair behind the desk, and for a moment he was just a man aged by something he had outrun for too long. "You grabbed her arm," she said. "You didn't mean to hurt her. You just wanted to stop her, to make her see reason. But she fell. She struck her head." He looked up now, eyes sharp, though not with denial. "And she died, just like that. And so you buried it. Let Elias believe it was his grief that killed her. Let the world believe it was illness. And when he died soon after, you took the only thing left of her, The portrait. "I made her immortal," he whispered. "You made her invisible, Miss Marple said. "Until now." He stood suddenly, knocking over the glass. The sound of it shattering across the floor snapped the air like a whip. "She would have ruined everything," he shouted. "Do you think the world would have cared who Clara was? Do you think they'd have wept for a girl with no name, no lineage, no place? I gave her more than Elias ever could. I gave her a legacy." "You gave yourself a legend," Miss Marple said, her voice calm as stone, "at the cost of hers." The door opened then, and Constable Farrow stepped in, along with Dr. Rowe and a second officer. Sir Arthur didn't resist. He didn't flee. He only looked at them with weary contempt, like a king who had outlived his kingdom. "There's no body," he said. "No grave. No proof." "But there's intent," Dr. Rowe replied. "There's concealment. You locked away a confession and altered a death. And Beatrice's attempt to finish what you started makes it clear this was no misunderstanding. This was maintenance of a lie." Sir Arthur didn't speak again as he was escorted from the room. He didn't need to. The echo of his silence would remain in the halls of that house for a long time, long after the headlines faded, long after the visitors stopped coming to see the painting that once held a secret. That evening, Miss Marple visited Margaret once more. She sat beside her on the small sofa as the fire crackled softly nearby. "He confessed," she said. "Not aloud, but fully." Margaret nodded slowly. Her eyes were tired but clear. "I always suspected. After I found the letters, it just confirmed what I felt for years. But even then, part of me hoped I was wrong." "It's natural," Miss Marple said. "We want the past to be tidy. It rarely is." "She should have had a name," Margaret said after a while. "Not just in death, in life. She should have been remembered for who she was." "She will be," Miss Marple promised. "The portrait will be displayed in the museum, with her name, with her story." Margaret smiled faintly, and it was the first genuine smile Miss Marple had seen from her since the beginning. Outside, the night stretched on, still and unburdened. And in the corner of the museum where the portrait would one day hang, there would be a small plaque, not of gold or marble, but simple brass. And it would read, "Clara Fel, beloved sister, muse, and memory, restored." And beside it, in the smallest engraving, one final note: "Truth cannot be buried, not forever." The days following Sir Arthur's quiet arrest moved with a peculiar rhythm, neither entirely still nor rushed. A calm had settled over the Langdon estate, but it was a strained, sort of quiet, as if the house itself held its breath. The portrait was gone now, entrusted to the museum for restoration and rightful display. Margaret remained under the care of family, recovering slowly, both in body and spirit. Beatrice Lane awaited formal charges, and the public, always hungry for its next scandal, had begun speculating loudly in newspapers and tea rooms across the county. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her routines in the village. Her garden needed tending, the parish accounts required reviewing, and life, in its quiet way, had moved on. But something, some subtle misalignment, still sat in her thoughts, like a pebble in the shoe. It wasn't guilt, nor was it fear. It was a question, one she couldn't yet articulate. It came to her the following Sunday, during service at St. Clement's. Reverend Burkitt was reading the final passage of his sermon, his voice rising to the expected rhythm. "And all things done in secret shall be brought into the light." A simple verse, a familiar one, and yet something in those words unlocked what had been troubling her. She had been so certain that the final drawer had been opened, the last lie pulled free. Sir Arthur's confession, partial though it was, had satisfied the public. The letters and photographs in the painting's compartment had been real. His motive had been selfish and grand. And yet, Miss Marple rose from the pew after service and walked without pause to Dr. Rowe's modest home near the square. He was surprised to see her, but not unkind. He made tea, as usual, asked politely after her roses. Then, as they sat in the parlour, she leaned forward and said, "The journal was a forgery." He blinked. "You're certain?" "No, but I believe so." He set his cup down carefully. "That's a bold claim, Miss Marple." It troubled me from the moment I saw it. The ink was right, the handwriting close, but the phrasing, Clara's voice in the letters and the journal were similar, yes, but not identical. The syntax was too formal in places, and more importantly, the journal lacked detail about Elias. That could be explained by trauma, or intention. Could it? She asked. Or could it be that the journal was planted by someone who wanted to guide the story in a specific direction? Dr. Rowe sat back. "You think Arthur forged the journal?" "I did. But now, I think the forgery came from someone else entirely. Someone who knew Elias better than they admitted, someone who never claimed to know Clara well, but somehow understood exactly what narrative would ignite Margaret's guilt and Arthur's downfall." He was quiet. Miss Marple pressed. "You told me you studied regional artists. You visited the estate often during the earlier years. You even knew about Carswell's last exhibitions. Facts only someone personally connected to his work would know." "Why?" Dr. Rowe's jaw tensed. "He was my uncle." It landed with more force than any confession that had come before. Miss Marple exhaled softly. It made sense now. The presence, the patience, the quiet positioning of facts throughout the investigation. Dr. Rowe had not merely observed the mystery unfold, he had directed its shape. "You weren't listed in his will," she said. "You weren't mentioned in the letters." "I was a child when Clara died," he replied. "My mother was Elias's sister. She cut ties with him after Clara's death, said he lost himself in obsession, but I remembered him, his stories, his sketches. After her death, I tracked his history, found the painting, found the whispers, and when I saw the portrait at Sir Arthur's home years later, I recognized her." "And so you returned," she said, "to write the ending yourself." "I couldn't bring them to justice then. I had no proof. But when Margaret returned and began asking questions, I knew the time had come. I helped her see what she was looking for, gave her the confidence to act." "You forged the journal," Miss Marple said softly. "I reconstructed it," he replied, "from Elias's letters, from Margaret's memories, from my own research. Every word true in spirit, even if not in ink." "But not all the truth," Miss Marple said. His eyes darkened. "You left something out," she continued. "Elias didn't just grieve Clara. He blamed himself. That wasn't Arthur's guilt alone. It was Elias's as well. He didn't stop the fight. He let it happen. And he covered it with Arthur, not because he was afraid, but because he believed they both were guilty." Dr. Rowe didn't answer. "You used Margaret's pain," she said. "You used her search for justice to complete your own. But in doing so, you manipulated a woman who deserved honesty." "She deserved closure," he said coldly. "And now she has it." "But you don't," Miss Marple said. "Because now that the truth has been tangled with invention, the whole of it will be questioned. Margaret's story, Elias's name, Clara's identity, they'll all be shadowed by your interference. I did what I had to." "Yes," she said. "You finished the portrait, but you signed it with a false hand." He stood then, no longer defensive, but weary. "What will you do?" She looked at him for a long time. "Nothing," she said finally. "Not yet. Margaret believes she has truth, and that may heal her. Arthur is undone. Beatrice faces consequences. The painting will bear Clara's name. The balance is close enough to justice for now. But I will keep the journal. Dr. Rowe nodded slowly. That's fair. She stood as well, drawing her coat around her shoulders. One more thing. There's a difference between truth and vengeance. They wear similar faces, but one heals, the other haunts. Outside, the street was bright with morning light, and as Miss Marple walked home past hedges and window boxes and quiet laughter spilling from tea rooms, she felt no triumph, only a gentle sorrow. The mystery had closed, yes, but in its final stroke it had revealed something even more enduring than guilt or innocence, that every story, even the true ones, can be framed to suit the hand that holds the brush. The wind had changed over St. Mary Mead. Subtle, but unmistakable, like the shift in a conversation just before something is admitted. For weeks the village had buzzed over the Langdon affair, the altered painting, the confession, the arrests. And now, with the museum preparing to unveil Clara's portrait in its rightful form and name, the noise had begun to quiet. But for Miss Marple, the case had not truly ended. Closure, she believed, required more than exposure. It needed clarity, and clarity was a rare thing, even in truth. She sat once more with Constable Farrow in his office, the same cramped room where their conversation had first begun, when Thomas Fletcher had trembled over a painting that looked wrong. Now Farrow looked down at the tidy report before him with a kind of frown that suggested unease rather than disagreement. "You're saying Dr. Rowe wasn't just a bystander," he said slowly, "that he forged the journal that got the whole thing moving again." "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied gently, "that he controlled the narrative from the edges. A forgery, yes, but crafted with facts. It muddied the waters enough to make Arthur's guilt seem inevitable, even before the hidden compartment was found." Farrow ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You always said the truth would show itself." "It did," she said. "But not cleanly. It rarely does. Truth is like varnish. It needs to be stripped carefully. Otherwise, the canvas beneath is damaged." He looked up at her, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "Should I bring Rowe in?" Miss Marple shook her head. "There's no law against context. No proof of malice, only motive. And his motive, though manipulative, served to bring about a version of justice." Farrow leaned back. "A version. Yes. But we mustn't pretend the full picture is ever free of shadow." He sighed and closed the folder. "So we leave it?" "We watch," she corrected. "People who blur the lines don't often stop after one masterpiece." When she left the station, she walked past the museum. Through the glass, she could see the portrait being hung in its new place. Clara's eyes, no longer hollowed by time or disguise, now carried the weight of recognition. The frame had been cleaned, but not replaced. The small brass plaque below bore her name, her story, and, in smaller text, a reference to Elias Carswell's final years. The hidden compartment was noted too, sealed now but acknowledged. Transparency in place of secrecy. Later that week, the museum held a quiet reopening. Margaret came, her posture still careful, her movements tentative, but her expression clearer than Miss Marple had ever seen it. She stood before the painting a long while, and when she spoke, it was to no one in particular. She's finally where she belongs. Miss Marple stood nearby. "And what of you, dear?" Margaret looked at her, then back to the portrait. "I think I'm only just starting to be. But not everyone attended." Sir Arthur remained in custody, awaiting trial for obstruction, evidence tampering, and long-standing fraud. The murder charge had slipped away. There was no conclusive proof of intent, and Elias's letter, while damning, was not considered legally definitive. Beatrice Lane, too, faced her own consequences, but the court had yet to decide how far her complicity extended. Dr. Rowe, however, was absent. That evening, Miss Marple returned home to find a letter waiting. No postmark, no signature, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. You were right. The story needed guidance, not control. I told myself I was restoring balance, but in truth, I was exacting it. Still, she has her name now. That, at least, is earned. I'll leave before the museum opens. Too many people looking for the next villain, and I've worn that face long enough. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it between the pages of her notebook. She didn't burn it. She didn't report it. Some endings, she understood, were better left untidy, like brushstrokes too thick to smooth, but too honest to erase. That weekend, over tea with her neighbour, Miss Hartnell, the subject inevitably came up. You always knew it wasn't just Arthur, didn't you? Miss Hartnell asked. Miss Marple smiled. I suspected the portrait had been painted over. More than once. But how did you know it was Rowe? Miss Marple lifted her teacup, eyes thoughtful. It was the ink. The ink? He mentioned the composition of 19th century inks in passing one day. A strange detail, given our conversation, was about brush technique. It struck me then. He'd studied more than art. He understood materials. He knew what would pass for genuine. And then there were the quotes in the journal, half phrases lifted directly from Elias's letters, but stitched together, subtle but off. A forgery by someone familiar with the source, but not the speaker. Miss Hartnell blinked. I'd never have noticed. Most wouldn't, that's the point. Outside, the village continued as it always had. Children laughing down the lane, shopkeepers setting out fresh loaves, a man polishing the sign outside the pub. And yet, beneath the quiet routine, something had shifted. The truth had been painted in at last, but only just enough. And though justice had been mostly served, a sliver of the story remained just beyond the frame. Miss Marple returned to her garden that afternoon, trowel in hand, humming softly to herself as she worked the earth. Some bulbs, she knew, took seasons to bloom, and some seeds planted in secrecy eventually found light. Whether they blossomed into beauty or poison, that, of course, depended entirely on who did the planting. As she placed a rose cutting into the soil, she murmured to herself, not all villains run, and not all heroes stay. But in the end, the truth always finds a way to root. And with that, she pressed the soil gently closed, as if sealing the final chapter. The case of Clara Fel was over. Or rather, it had finally begun to be remembered. The sun had dipped low behind the hills of St. Mary Mead, casting long amber shadows across the garden walls and curling through the hedgerows in golden ribbons. In Miss Marple's sitting room, the windows were open to the evening air, and the faint scent of rosemary and turned soil drifted in. She sat at her writing desk, updating the final entry in her notebook about the Clara Fel affair, each line recorded with precise calmness, not for posterity, but to ensure nothing was left misunderstood. Outside, the world had resumed its soft murmur. The village, ever resilient, had already folded the scandal into its rhythm. Mrs. Price had begun organizing a historical panel on lost women in art, inspired by Clara's story. The museum had sold out of its small reprint booklets, featuring a reproduction of the painting and a brief biography. Margaret, though still fragile, had been seen walking through the green with a shawl around her shoulders and a quiet sense of presence that hadn't been there before. And yet, as Miss Marple closed her notebook, her fingers paused for just a moment at the edge of the final page. Something wasn't finished. She stood and walked slowly to the cabinet across the room, the one where she kept personal correspondence too private for her bookshelf. From a worn leather envelope, she withdrew the unsigned letter left by Dr. Rowe. She read it again. Not the words themselves, but the shape of them, the tone beneath the prose. They were not bitter, nor did they plead. They were calm, steady, composed, but they carried a note of detachment, almost too neat, too resolved. It was the closing line that returned to her now. That, at least, is earned. Earned, not owed. Not given. Earned. The phrasing had struck her the first time, but now it echoed with something else. She placed the letter on the desk beside her notebook and took out Elias Carswell's final letter again, the one found hidden behind the portrait. She had kept a copy, and though many regarded it as conclusive, she had never quite accepted it without skepticism. Her eyes ran over the passage once more. She didn't fall. She was pushed by the man who hung her face on the wall. The wording had always felt theatrical, a little too precise. At the time, it had matched the tone of a broken man. But what if it hadn't come from grief? What if it had come from someone else? She returned to the journal, a supposedly forged one, created by Dr. Rowe to reignite the case. But as she turned through its pages again, one corner near the end felt strange beneath her fingertips. The paper was thick, and when she tilted it under the lamplight, she noticed the faintest outline beneath the ink, almost as if something had been erased. Carefully, with a soft cloth and her magnifier, she coaxed the layer of ink away from the edge of the page, revealing a signature. It wasn't Elias's. It was Margaret's. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, and she sat back, heart slowing with clarity. It was Margaret who had written the journal. Not Dr. Rowe, not completely. He had guided her, certainly, helped her structure it, polish the edges. But the core thoughts, the confessions, the pleas, they had come from her. And that meant one thing: Margaret had known more than she claimed. She hadn't just suspected Arthur of causing Clara's death. She had known it, lived with it, carried it, and for years she had said nothing. The question came not with judgment, but with curiosity. Why? She returned to Margaret the next day, under the gentle guise of sharing news about the portrait's official listing. They sat by a window overlooking the orchard, a pot of mint tea between them. Margaret looked tired, but her eyes were clear. "There's one thing that still troubles me," Miss Marple said after a pause. "About the journal." Margaret didn't flinch. "You don't think it's real?" "I think it's more real than anyone knows," she said softly, "because I believe you wrote most of it." Margaret looked down. "I did. I didn't intend to share it, not at first. I only meant to record it for myself. But when Dr. Rowe read it, he said it could serve as testimony, that even if it wasn't legal proof, it might stir something." "You never confronted Arthur?" "I couldn't. Not then. I was too afraid. I thought I was mistaken. But deep down, I knew." She stirred, her tea, hands trembling. "Clara had told me she felt unsafe, but she always said Arthur wouldn't hurt her, that he was just cruel when provoked. But that night, she was planning to leave, and I knew he wouldn't allow it." Miss Marple let the silence settle between them. "Why not come forward sooner?" Margaret's eyes lifted, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something old in them. Not cowardice, not grief, but calculation. "Because part of me wanted to ruin him," Margaret said plainly. "And that meant waiting until his reputation was high enough, until it hurt." And in that moment, Miss Marple saw the final truth. Justice had not merely been served. It had been staged. Margaret had waited, withheld, chosen the moment with as much precision as Rowe had crafted the narrative. Between the two of them, Arthur Langdon never stood a chance. When she left the cottage, Miss Marple felt no urge to intervene further. The law had taken its course. The painting was restored. Clara was remembered. But the story that the world would read, the one in the museum's little booklet, was just one version. A quiet wind stirred the lane as she walked, tugging at her scarf and carrying the scent of distant rain. She passed the post office and paused. A new notice was posted outside. Retrospective exhibition, The Lost Works of Elias Carswell, curated by Dr. Jonathan Rowe. So he had returned after all. Miss Marple folded her hands behind her back and smiled faintly. There was always another story. Always another canvas beneath the first layer of paint. And as she turned toward home, she thought, not of Clara or Arthur, but of the next ripple already forming somewhere else, quiet and unnoticed. Because the thing about mysteries, she knew, was that they never truly ended. They simply waited until someone was ready to see them.